Okay.
We are live.
Okay, great. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
Welcome to our our guy. Maybe you should welcome me since I'm on your page. How you doing?
I'm well. My page is your page. Me.
Mi casa, mi casa.
Yeah. Love it.
It's all good. It's all good. All right, all right. Well, I'm glad to be back from. Were we out for 2 weeks or were we out for 1 week?
I think we might have been out for 2 weeks.
Oh no. Okay. All right. All right. Well, I'm very glad to be back, and I'm very glad to be addressing chapter 16. Chapter 16. I don't know if I've said this before. It's just that every time I read it, chapter 16, the production of absolute and relative surplus value is the title of this chapter. I'm reminded of the work that I do, not just generally as an educator, or the work that I've been doing over the years, Matt, but I'm reminded of conversations that I have with students about the production of surplus value and the creation of surplus value, and in a sense, the creation of the sort of work, or rather the creation of workers such that they produce surplus value, such that they represent, such that their work represents surplus labor. And so this is very neat. This is a very neat and interesting discussion for me. But before we get into it, Matt, is there anything that you'd like to share? Hello, Garay.
What would I like to share? I don't know. I've been working hard. It's been kind of messing a little bit with my sleep cycle, so I need to figure out a better way to go about things, because it's very important to. You got to figure out ways to work that are both productive, but also that are also that they keep you safe, or keep you okay.
Yeah.
In order to be more productive. In order to be more productive, don't overdo yourself.
Okay.
I am my own. I am both the worker and the capitalist, in the sense I am extracting as much value as I can out of my brain and waking life as humanly possible. But I know, as a smart capitalist, I can't overwork my worker, me, to death. Still get the results I need.
Okay. All right. Well, having said that, I get into it. I'd like to get into it. And what I'd like to do is, as I've said, I'd like to begin with a discussion of the factory and schools even as factories, so that we can then proceed onto this more abstract discussion about the production of surplus value, and ultimately so that we can not only link it back to the positions and the dispositions that are cultivated and the socializing that takes place in school systems, not just on the part of the owners of school systems, but even on the part of those of us who labor in them, such that we produce surplus labor, such that we produce surplus value. And then from there, if we have time, and I think we might, get into a discussion of history, where we might even consider the recent presidential elections as empirical substance with which to make sense of the abstractions that are addressed in this particular chapter. Let's see how this next hour goes. Okay, so what I'd like to do then is I'd like to begin by saying, Matt, before I ask you question. I'd like to share a thought, share a quote, and then share a preliminary closing thought before I ask you the question. And it goes like this. It is in chapter 16 that Marx would compel educators to get off high horses. I'm not saying that all educators are on a high horse, but my experience over the 30 plus years that I've been an educator is such that I'm witness to a variety of pretensions and conceitedness on the part of educators in relation to their students, in relation to me, in relation to me even, right? And in relation to the communities in which they work. In any case, it is in chapter 16, as I say, that Marx would compel educators to get off high horses, and based on the objective similarities between factory owners and the owners of schools, illuminate shared interest between them and other workers. What I'd like to do at this point is I just like to share a short quote, okay? And the quote from chapter 16, again, the title of the chapter is The Production of Absolute and Relative Surplus Value. The quote goes like this. Capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities. It is essentially the production of surplus value. The laborer produces not for himself, but for capital. It no longer suffices, therefore, that he should simply produce. He must produce surplus value. That laborer alone is productive, who produces surplus value for the capitalist, and thus works for the self-expansion of capital. If we may take an example from outside the sphere of production of material objects, a schoolmaster, he says, is a productive laborer when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his scholars, he works like a horse to enrich the school proprietor. There's a material comparison that is made here, right? In the sense that Marx identifies that labor takes place in spaces, right, that do not belong to those who work there. That labor generates surplus value for the owners of those spaces. And the laboring process in both cases, right, is one in which commodities are packaged into existing commodities. And we'll get into this in just a little bit. This material comparison provides an elusive opportunity. In other words, by equating the activity of a horse with instruction, Marx illuminates the commoditization of instruction. This is the basic critique that Marxist educators make as to the relationship between the depositing of knowledge in students' consciousness today for their exploitation tomorrow. In fact, it is in this relationship that the metaphorical weight of the anecdote is greatest. Why? Because where the body of students are positioned as receptacles, and where we have already been informed about the positioning of bodies in ways that are not only artificial, but rob humanity of its vitality, of its essence, are thus informed of the objective exercises of their alienation. Recall, before I ask you this question, Matt, recall his explanation of subordination, and I'll take the reader to a preceding discussion, a discussion about a spider, a bee, and an architect. Marx writes in this preceding chapter, he says, a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. That is to say, Matt, that there is a design in this space. And the design of this space is to create labor. The design of the space where whatever commodity happens to be in production is not simply the production of a single commodity, but is the production and the reproduction of surplus labor and surplus value. Your thoughts?
Well, see, so Office Depot right here, they don't make money.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't make pencils, they make money, right?
Yeah.
The pencil is just is the vehicle towards making that money.
Yeah.
Now you take a school, for instance. Now, a school, if it's private, they don't train students. They don't make educations. They make money. And if it's a public
Yeah.
institution, well, then they don't make student. Again, they don't make educations. They make workers. I mean, either
Yeah.
way, what we're looking at here, if it is handled by, let's say, by the public infrastructure, then the process of education is about producing workers for the economy. Now, if it's a private institution, it still has that element of producing workers for private exploitation, but it is also in and of itself private exploitation, right? So there's multiple things going on. Now, what I think is, when we talk about, you mentioned earlier, you opened this with saying that teachers need to get off their high horses. They need to drop these pretensions, right? Now, I think,
if not many. Go ahead.
I would argue it's the majority, but
Okay.
but that's just my experience. I mean, but you know more of these people than I do, so maybe you have a better opinion. I don't have the highest opinion of teachers. I don't have the highest opinions of poets either, just to be honest with you. Now, the majority, I don't have the highest opinions of the majority of people. I think this is messing up in a lot of ways, and maybe I'm messing up too. But as far as this, let's stick with this here. I think that we have to look at the fact that there are certain aspects to a lot of society that would exist independent of exploitation, right? So there's things that would exist independent of exploitation, such as teaching the young, right?
Yeah.
Such as this kind of generational transmission of information. Now, that could be handled directly within the family, or it could end up being handled by experts of the tribe, of the village, of the city, of the whatever. And this can happen all independent of exploitation, right? Outside the purpose of exploitation. And so what happens under capitalism, what happens under any exploitive economy, is that these things get mangled and distorted. These things that could be noble, they could be wonderful, they could be just whatever. And sometimes we're able to squeeze some nobility and wonderful and wonder into our capitalist lives, right? And we're able to do that, and we're able to sneak it in. But it always comes at a cost. It always comes at a risk. It always comes with us fighting the very institutions that we are in for supposedly doing our job. Now, so that's the illusion of society, and that illusion of society, that illusion that's offered in a capitalist society to teachers, that you're gonna like teach the next generation, they're gonna be great citizens, they're gonna be this, they're gonna be that, you're gonna teach them how to be responsible, you're gonna teach them the good values, all these kinds of things that people take on to say, I am a teacher, what a noble profession, right? The nobility of this profession is rooted in something that is very real to the human experience, but is distorted in our capitalist order of things. And as it gets distorted, nobody tells the teacher about this distortion. Nobody in capitalist society informs the teacher that this wonderful thing that you want to engage in has been horribly mangled. Nobody tells them that. So a lot of these people are operating on these illusions that what they're doing is so great and wonderful, blah, blah, blah. But what they're actually inherently participating in is the production of people who are designed to go out and be exploited, right? So that's what's actually happening. Even if they are good teachers. If you look at like, why do teachers tend to get in trouble, right? If you look at the teachers that have tend to get in trouble, that are fighting with their institutions, of course, unless barring abuse, right? Barring like beating the kids or something worse, doing that kind of stuff, right? barring being a danger to the students. So putting that aside, why do teachers tend to get in trouble? They tend to get in trouble for speaking out against the
Yeah.
structures and strictures of society as a whole. You know, the
Yeah.
problems of society and the things that they, you know, you students all in this room are going to be exploited, beaten, this, that, the other by society that means you a great deal of harm, right?
Yeah.
Be it as workers or be it as like people who've been the victim of colonization in this country, where you have not just the kind of capitalist worker thing, you also have this, you know, 500 years of conquest thing happening to you.
Yeah.
When you inform your students of that relationship, when you inform your students that that is the shape of society, that's when you tend to get in trouble, right? So you're not, because you're not supposed to be saying those things. What you're supposed to be doing is telling them how wonderful they are or how great they are, and they can do anything if they achieve it. And I guess that's maybe what you're supposed to be saying, or maybe you're supposed to be telling them that, hey, you need to like lower your expectations, you need to be realistic. Let me tell you something, like, you know, like, or you're supposed to be like a drill sergeant. All those things are acceptable. All those things are acceptable these are kind of your acceptable choices. Now you tell them there's not something wrong with you, there's something wrong with the school. There's not something wrong with you, there's something wrong with the police department in this city. There's not something wrong with you, there's something wrong with this city. There's nothing wrong with you, there's something wrong with this state. There's nothing wrong with you, there's something wrong with this country. Then all of a sudden you start getting yourself in trouble.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we have to really understand, that when we talk about these teachers who are perhaps on this high horse, is that they don't seem to understand that there's something wrong with the school. They don't seem to understand there's something wrong with the system as a whole.
Yeah.
And once they're made aware of that, maybe they will, or maybe they will resist it. Maybe they in their heart they don't want to believe that kind of thing. Who knows? Who knows? But I think that when they do profess this idea of the nobility of the teaching as a profession, it is really connected to the fact that there is a place and is a role for such a designation in a good society, in a place where everyone is having their needs met. You know, like that is actually something wonderful to do. That is something, there is a nobility in it. It's just that everything in the society is so horribly mangled that what you actually end up doing is usually for many students becoming the first face of the lad, you know.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a few people, and then I'm reminded of 43 people. You know, in one case, I'm reminded, of course, of Paulo Freire. Garay here makes note of him, and I'll read his note a little more carefully later on. But Garay makes note of Paulo Freire, who in fact was exiled for getting off the script. Another person also got off the script and lost his life. Of course, his name was Lucio Cabañas, in the central state of Guerrero in Mexico, late 60s, early 70s. And then, of course, about 5-6 years ago, 43 students who took up this task of reducing the learning experience to some psychological set of exercises and somersaults and juggling on the part of individual students, but contextualizing learning and the learning process within a national and even international economy. Those students have been disappeared. Anyway, I'd like to make note of a second and no less important metaphor, not just in terms of this comparison between students, between educators and factory workers, right? But what I'd like to do, again, this is the discussion that's taking place in this book. Remember that factory workers, be they working in a capitalist factory, and for that matter, as we'll hear in just a moment, be they working in a sausage factory, have the task of packaging commodities into other commodities. And Marx illuminates this this condition. What I'd like to do is I'd like to read this quote and then talk about it a little bit, and then turn it over back to you, Matt. And I'll begin with the last sentence that I shared just a few moments ago. If we may take an example from outside the sphere of production of material objects, a schoolmaster is a productive laborer when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his scholars, he works like a horse to enrich the school proprietor. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of in a sausage factory does not alter the relation. Hence, the notion of a productive labor implies not merely a relation between work and useful effect, between labor and product of labor, but also a specific social relation of production, a relation that has sprung up historically and stamps the laborer as the direct means of creating surplus value. I'm not sure if Marx kept kosher, Matt.
Yeah.
Sure if he did.
Yeah.
But his Hebrew ancestry must have made him averse to the consumption of pigs' intestines. It is, after all, feces that makes its way through it on its way out of the animal's body. And here is just the point. If students are comparable to intestinal lining, then what is it that is inserted into both if it isn't scraps? For their seasoning, and here I'm talking about the seasoning of the intestines, and here I'm talking about the seasoning of students, and their drying for subsequent consumption. Seen this way, Marx is preempting the sort of critique that Black sociologist of education W.E.B. Du Bois was making some 60 years after, at the turn of the century, after Kapital's publication. Of course, I'm talking about the turn of the century from the 1800s into the 1900s, right? In his critique, of course, Du Bois was critiquing the back to basics training that was taking place in Black colleges, in what we today call historically Black colleges and universities, early in the 20th century. Keep in mind, right, that in chapter 15, we also read about 19th century schooling. Anyway, your thoughts, Matt?
Well, before we move on to this, the last thing I want to make about the last conversation we're having. We're talking about people being murdered in different parts of the world, but nothing of that nature that I know of that I can point to has happened in the United States in recent history like that. But people have lost their jobs. I mean, like one of the stories I remember not too recent past was the case of Karen Salazar. With LAUSD. I mean, she got thrown down.
Right?
Yeah, the high school for teaching. I think it was the autobiography of Malcolm X, and that they ended up giving her the boot. And I know another teacher, Mark Gonzalez, he also felt the pressure there, and he ended up kind of resigning in
Sal Castro.
Huh?
Sal Castro.
Sal Castro. I mean, I didn't even think about that. But yeah, Sal Castro. What a great example of a man who almost ended up in the pen doing some serious time for his activity. The FBI was investigating the walkouts back in the 60s. Another recent case, I know that there's been a number of people that have that have gone down. Just a horror show going over with Pico Rivera. I mean, there's been an incredible battle with Pico Rivera that includes a number of people. I don't want to get too into it because I don't want to say the wrong thing and that they can speak for themselves, but because it's still ongoing. But the thing with the Pico Rivera, with a number of people that I know very well, and who are very, very brave kind of people, just fighting for basic kind of ethnic studies, kind of teach the children a way that will dignify themselves, right? Have faced huge backlash, and there have been really strong right-wing elements that have attacked them. and you see again this kind of the moderate middle side with the right-wing elements,
Yeah.
because the right-wing element wants the same thing the moderate middle wants, which is for you to be exploited, for you to be used, for you to get chewed up by the system. They just want to put it in a way that's a little less open and obvious, right? So
Yeah.
that tends to be the way of things. And
Yeah.
so people who want to do something different, people who want to provide an education that actually uplifts the children, they get attacked. They get attacked. For people who want to do that noble thing, you keep telling teachers that they're involved in, which is like to educate the children, to hand them the baton of the world, and and give them the baton of human society to march us into another century. People trying to do that in a dignified manner end up getting attacked, because that
Yeah.
is not the demand of capitalist society.
Yeah.
Um, but back to what you were when we were talking about the idea of like students, what they do want for students to come out as essentially put through a meat grinder and just in sausage.
Yeah.
That is definitely the case. I mean, because again, this is like, people talk a lot today about a school to prison pipeline,
Yeah.
and that as this horrible new phenomenon. And in many ways, it is a horrible new phenomenon. It begins kind of in the 80s and explodes, and like so many things, begins like in that time, and it's exploded greater, and certainly in 2000s has really came to the point where we're really coining it now. And certainly that is a horrible thing, and certainly that is a horrible new development. And I don't want to speak lightly of it. But
Yeah.
the reality is that public schooling has always been a pipeline. It has always been a pipeline, and it's been a pipeline even for middle income jobs, even higher income jobs. It's a pipeline. You go here, and then you go there. You go here, you're processed, you go there. You're here, you're processed, you go there. And we oftentimes think about the injustice of it is that, is the final destination. The injustice is the final destination. If my final destination is jail, well, this is a horrible injustice, right? But we don't often necessarily think if my final destination is a meatpacking factory, maybe this is a horrible injustice.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
regardless of where that final destination is, whether it be a prison cell or a law office, education, particularly public education, is a pipeline. It's a pipeline to somewhere.
Yeah. 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 Actually, there's his discussion of the factory system of production. Up until about certainly in up until April of this year. Up until April of this year, at least as far as my the labor in which I have found myself, the factory system of producing and packaging commodities for their later consumption is premised on a set of factory relationships, from the turn of the century, from the late 1800s into the beginning of the 1900s. And that is essentially the model, the platform, the architecture in which I have found myself up until April or March of this year, 2020. And of course, that's not by accident, as you note. That is in fact by design. That I've turned to a preceding chapter is of little surprise, in my discussion of the bee, the spider, and the architect. That I've turned to a preceding chapter is of little surprise, as there are a variety of dialogical relationships between different chapters in this book. What I would like to note in this case is Marx's metaphorical attention to the factory after first having discussed the relationship, right, that exists, or the relationships that exist between bugs, insects, spiders, bees, right, and architects. In other words, Marx is setting the discursive terrain, not just for the positioning of the labor in the spaces of labor, but also for the cultivation of those inclinations that would normalize and thus escape from labor's conscious attention, the theft of their time, the theft of their exercise, for the production of surplus labor, of surplus value. What I'd like to do is return to the discussion of absolute and relative surplus value, but I suppose if you have something to say before I do so, Matt, I'd like to just finish this particular segment by saying that, you know, one doesn't simply surrender one's time. One doesn't simply surrender one's work. You know, one is cultivated. And since, you know, your interlocutor this morning is an educator, your interlocutor, me, it's a fancy word for saying you're, you know, you're the guy that you're talking to, right, is an educator, right? I happen to be looking at the ways in which I am complicit and my colleagues are complicit in generating this, you know, these inclinations, these dispositions, these proclivities for a so-called work ethic, you know, thievery. Really.
And what happens when you step out of bounds of that? What happens when someone steps? I mean, you don't have to tell me, because I mean, I don't want to, you know, again, this is the reality of things, that you can't even discuss the particulars and peculiarities of the consequences people might face in the labor they face, because that in fact will bring about the consequences. So I mean, that's kind of the world we live in. I mean, that's the level of coercion that takes place in the everyday coercion of capitalist relations that we live under. We live under everyday coercion, where we know not to speak out in our place of employment, and not to even speak out in public about certain places of employment. I'm gonna leave it there, because I don't want to this conversation any further. But the point is, I mean, like that's the kind of the kind of world we live in, and most people are very well aware of that. Now there's the element of coercion, but I'd say what's even more prevalent in society than coercion is what you're pointing out: the cultivation, the fact that you don't even feel that it's coercion. In fact, you yourself become a coercer. I mean, like, you know, like who is more coercive than your coworker? It's telling you to stop. Like, what are you talking about? This is great. What are you talking about? You're gonna get us all in trouble. What are you talking about? You know, like, this is the most coercive force imaginable, much more so than the bosses, is the coworker, because coworker actually makes you it speaks to, like, it pulls upon the strings of guilt and of, like, honor and duty and something else that you owe beyond yourself, because with your boss, at least you have, like, some type of, like, combative relationship potentially. But with somebody who's side by side, you know, and you're gonna rock the boat. We're all gonna drown. Right. All of a sudden, you find yourself like, all right. You know.
There's a point to which I'd like to get. Hello, Dust. How are you? There's a point to which I'd like to get in just a bit, and if one is not careful in reading chapter 16, one might miss it. And it's just what you're talking about in this very moment, Matt. And it's this discussion of, you know, where we become our own supervisors, that we patrol ourselves. And Marx talks about it in terms of the formal subjection of labor and the real subjection of labor. And I'd like to bring that up in just a little bit. But for now, what I'd like to do is return then to this discussion of absolute and relative surplus value. And keep in mind that this production constitutes the prime condition of the commoditization of labor. It is in its scale as labor power that both time and technology are monopolized by capital for the extraction of surplus value. Of absolute surplus value, Marx writes, the prolongation of the working day beyond the point at which the laborer would have produced just an equivalent for the value of his labor power, and the appropriation of that surplus labor by capital, this is the production of absolute surplus value. Of relative surplus value, he writes, It forms the general groundwork of the capitalist system and the starting point for the production of relative surplus value. The latter presupposes that the working day is already divided into two parts, and we've had this discussion already: necessary labor and surplus labor. In order to prolong the surplus labor, the necessary labor is shortened by methods whereby the equivalent of wages is produced in less time. The prolongation, the production of absolute surplus value turns exclusively upon the length of the working day, but the production of relative surplus value revolutionizes out and out the technical processes of labor and the composition of society. What I'd like to do at this point is get at something that you were talking about just a few moments ago, Matt. Thus, it is in the patrolling of the spaces of labor by way of the parameters of time, of space, the parameters of surplus value, right? That absolute surplus value. That absolute surplus value is generated. And as architects design space and its apparatuses so that elevated levels of control of labor and surplus value may be generated, absolute surplus value makes way for relative surplus value. Consider what he wrote in an initial attention to this point, and I'd like to turn attention here, Matt, to a discussion of the ways in which the material conditions of our existence figure in our even physiological existence. He says, the instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development to which human labor has attained, but they are also indicators of the social conditions under which that labor is carried on. Among the instruments of labor, those of a mechanical nature, which, taken as a whole, we may call the bone and muscles of production, offer much more decided characteristics of a given epoch of production. In a wider sense, we may include among the instruments of labor, in addition to those things that are used for directly transferring labor to its subject, and which therefore, in one way or another, serve as conductors of activity. What is happening here, right, is that Marx is, by way of this last quote that I've just read, Marx is setting up for a discussion that we can understand about the ways in which our positioning, the ways in which our handling, be they of pigs' intestines, be they of a horse's reins, or be it of our handling of our students' heads, right? That we are also being socialized to perceive and interact with the world in ways that conform with the capitalist system of production, such that the pig's intestines, the horse, right, and the student is cultivated such that he or she, or that they, right, interact with one another and with the world in which history has created for them, that they interact with that world in ways that correspond with the interest of capitalist production and the generation of surplus value. Anyway, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, I think that a lot of people would hear you talking about, like, where does capitalism take place? It takes place in time and space. They would think about this kind of thing as being kind of like either self-evident or even like silly to mention. I mean, it sounds silly to talk about things. Where do things happen? They happen in time and space. Right? It sounds kind of like what? But the reality is that we operate on so many levels of presupposition that we don't question these things. We don't question the way schools are structured. We don't question the way factories are structured. We don't question the way things are structured, because we think of them as inherent. We think of them as normal. We think of them as no different than the mountains or the stars. We think of them
Yeah.
as like, of course, a factory is shaped that way. Of course, factories exist. Of course, people do pull the lever like this. Of course, you go to school and then there's a piece of chalk and it's gonna go across the board. Of course,
Yeah.
that's the way it is. And that this kind of understanding of the world as it is, as being the way the world is meant to be, and you participate in it. You don't really think about it. You don't question. You don't even think to question it. Is how we are trained. I mean, it's how we are trained. We're trained to think of these things as inherent, and not just we're trained to think about our activities not as our peculiar, historically developed activities.
Mm-hmm.
We're trained to think of our activities as, you know, what they are, right? So why would you even say that capitalism takes place in time and space? Why would you say that education takes place in time and space? What are you even talking about? Well, it gets us to challenge these presuppositions, right?
Yeah.
And most people, I think, operate in a way where they think they've learned something because they challenge one set of presuppositions, but then they don't even understand that there's like there's like many levels of presuppositions above
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And that, you know, what they think they're looking at, let's say they think they look at the cause, they think that they look around them, they see all these effects, right? And they think that I outsmarted this thing, and now I'm looking at the cause, and yet the cause they're looking at is actually the effect of an even higher cause, or even
Yeah.
a prior cause.
Yeah.
And so that kind of that kind of way of thinking is kind of I don't know. So when you mention, you know, like these things taking place in time and space, my immediate thought is like, well, where else would they happen other than
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
and space?
Yeah.
Um, but
But even
but
time and space are historical
because
conflicts.
no, I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying that it's not relevant or it's not
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
to say, but it's saying that's how, even when talking about
Yeah.
capital, my mind is still trained to be like, well, where the hell else would it take place? It's time and space, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, where
Yeah.
where else would things happen other than time and space,
Yeah.
other than in physical reality? Where would
Yeah.
they take place? So, but that's kind of the question of like how we shape. Even language itself is shaped. You know, all these things, even our means of communication,
Yeah.
can be called into question.
Yeah.
Um, and so, which called into question. I mean, I think that, you know, because of the way our society is structured, we think to call into question is to discredit, right? Because that's how obedient we are,
Yeah.
right? We don't understand that to call into question could actually serve to deepen our understanding in something. If
Yeah.
we call into question how it works, we will more deeply understand the process, right? We can see its history, and we can see where we stand in its history. We can see what potential future. We can more deeply understand. We can more deeply understand the word understand if we would approach it that way, right? But we don't approach things that way, and we approach things that to call something into question is actually to attempt to destroy it,
Yeah.
attempt to whatever. Because our capitalist training tells us that when you call something into question, you're saying this is an injustice. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to and many
Yeah.
things are. But the idea that to even ask questions is somehow transgressive. That's what our education actually teaches us.
You
It
know.
teaches us that it's transgressive to ask questions, that it's actually an aggressive posture, that it's antisocial,
Yeah.
to raise questions within within the process of learning, right?
Yeah.
Well, why is that? That's
Yeah.
not because the arrogance. It's not because of the individual arrogance of professors. It's not because of the individual arrogance of instructors. It's not because of the individual arrogance of high school teachers. It is because of the capitalist system. The capitalist system is not here to listen to your questions. It is not here to help you with the wideness of your eyes and the fertility of your imagination. The capitalist system here is for you to get to work.
It's to sabotage the why of things.
Yeah.
You know. I wonder if, you know, when we hear, however condescendingly and patronistically we hear about, you know, why don't people ask why anymore? Why do they stop asking why once they get? Well, of course they stop asking why, because they go to a place where, you know, imagination and art, poetry, is sabotaged. And I'm not speaking just literally. I'm sorry, I'm not only speaking metaphorically, I'm speaking literally. You know, you go to school to have that capacity, you know, removed from you, because it's in that capacity that one has the possibility of as the saying goes, imagining another world, imagining another set of social relationships,
Yeah.
right, that are in the interest of the people that find themselves together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening? I mean, I had a horrible time in school. I had a horrible time in school.
Yeah.
Because I just can't get with the program. I mean, I'm just so. I mean, I'm saying it's a joke, but like the reality is, I just can't. I mean, maybe it's good. I mean, it's both good and bad, right? It is what it is. But I mean, I'm told this story that when I was like 5 or 6 years old, our instruction was to make paper mache ornaments, Christmas ornaments. But I knew we had so many Christmas ornaments at home because my mother really loved Christmas. And so I was like, wait a minute, like I have all these Christmas ornaments at home. This is a waste of my time to make this paper mache ornament. Right. And then they were like, no, just do it. Just do it. And I said, I ended up protesting. And I said, this is a waste of time. And they kept pushing. And I said, this is an infringement on my civil rights. Right. And I'm like, so I don't know where I heard this before, but I said, this is an infringement on my civil rights. And then they like insisted. And then I threw myself on the ground and refused to move.
Yeah. Wow.
Because I had observed somewhere that this is what you do. On your civil rights. And so like I viewed the making of a paper mache ornament when I knew we had ornaments at home. I knew I knew we were not lacking for Christmas ornaments.
Yeah.
So I could do something better with my time. I could make a card for my mom. I could make a wreath. I could do something. But like, like to make a paper mache ornament, oh no. That did not comport with the material world I lived in and the material needs of my Christmas time.
Think about the theater of discipline around that moment. It wasn't simply to discipline you, right? Whatever the theater was to discipline you was to set you up as a theatrical example, right? Yeah. Such that the other workers, producers of Christmas ornaments, because that's what they were doing, they were working, laboring, right? That they, not turn their heads and see what the future labor organizer is doing.
Well, I mean, that's my self-criticism as a 5-year-old protester, is that I did this as an individual act, right, which was like the infantile anarcho type activity. I was kind of a libertarian almost. I mean, I did this just as like upon my impulses. I had been treated unjustly. I refused. What I should have done was organize. Exploited here. We are being told to make these useless paper mache ornaments. Do your family have ornaments? Anyone here who's like has ornaments? Like, we should do something else. We should do something productive with our time. Something where we will not be alienated from these Christmas ornaments that won't even be put into use, right? So what are we doing here? And so that was.
Go ahead. I'm interrupting.
That's why I threw myself to the ground. Now instead of I should have been the mentality of we. And it took some time to learn that. It's I'm still probably learning that. But I did not learn that from my preschool or kindergarten teacher. I learned that elsewhere. And I'm in the process of learning that elsewhere. But like that, nothing in schooling taught me.
Why would you learn collectivist thinking in a capitalist educational system, be it a private one or a public one, if both systems of socialization? I suppose a preacher, a priest, a minister might talk about, the institution of churches and so on, maybe, and some other person that has a set of experiences in some other institution would talk about the socializing capacities of those institutions. Your interlocutor, as I say, Matt, right, has decades experience in the school system, so that's why he, right, is casting light on these particular socializing practices and asking, what for me is a rhetorical question, and that is, why would schools cultivate a collectivist sentiment and understanding about the shared experiences of people when it counters what the system is set out to do, which is to produce surplus value? Recently I came across a meme on Facebook of African children sitting in a circle. I don't know if you've seen that image. of African children sitting in a circle such that their feet, they're sitting on the ground with their legs extended such that their feet meet with one another, and they configure so positioned,
I've
right?
seen it.
I don't know if you've seen that image. I think it's a magnificent image. I think about another image that I've seen, and I'll contrast these two images to this third image. But let me talk about the second image. I've seen the image of people sitting around a fire, and they find themselves in discussion in this particular image. And these are images, and this is imagery of people in non-Western, quote unquote, pre-colonial societies, if you will, right? Where people from the get-go, right, from infancy, are shown ways in which they might think about themselves collectively, right? Think about the community and think about their place, and to understand how valuable and important they are to the community, and how important the community is, to each member of the circle. Why am I bringing this up? Because as an educator in this capitalist society for the 35 years in which I've been one, I had it well. I felt it greatest early on, back in the late 80s and early 90s is when I felt it, when I was getting into this profession, when I was getting into this job. It was my greatest fear back then, as an educator in the classroom, that the students in their entirety would turn against me, that I would not be able to execute, the lesson plan for the day, or for the hour and 15 minutes of instruction, or whatever amount of time that I had with that group of students. And I was always very careful, and those educators that have had this experience will know what I'm talking about, that there are those students in the classroom that generate the sort of questions to get other students to think about things in ways that are in the interest of themselves, together and collectively. And so we are trained, right, to nip those moments at the bud. Otherwise, we will lose control of the classroom. At least that's the way that we were being trained in the teacher education programs. And there was literally, units of instruction when I was in the teacher ed program at Cal Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks and in Ventura. There were units of instruction in which I was prepared for such moments, and I was prepared also to nip those moments at the bud. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to execute. And maybe I'm not using the word execute as I should, but effectively, the lesson, the lesson plan. Anyway, I just turned it back to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, that could happen. You could have a mutiny. But I don't know. I mean, it's definitely a balancing act. But like, I think that when we talk about stuff, I mean, what's the practical advice? I mean, the practical advice is to just kind of do what you can. I mean, same thing. I mean, do what you can and don't get fired. Do what you can, don't get fired. If don't get fired as long as you can. As long as you can avoid getting fired, do it, because then you can be more effective that way. I think it was Ron Goches who actually had a class during one of these Association of Rasa Educator what do you call it?
Meetings, maybe?
No, not a meeting, like a forum, like a
workshop,
like Knox, like a conference. They had a conference, right? So they had a big conference, and he did a workshop. He did one of the workshops there, and it was like basically how to like how to have like radical politics and not get fired. So I mean, like for those who want to engage in that kind of work, like ask Ron. I mean, he probably tell you a lot better than I could. I mean, he knows the ins and outs, right? So like ask someone like that. He knows how to do it. So
yeah, yeah.
So and like Ron, but like that's what people should be doing. I mean, they should be doing what they can to get your politics wherever you can. No different than you would working at a factory, no different than you would working at Target, no different than you would working anywhere else, right? Get the politics across where you can, and try not to get fired. Like that's the practical takeaway for what teachers should be doing, and stop thinking yourself as like I don't know, Plato or Socrates or something like that. Like stop thinking yourself as this person that lives outside of time and space.
Yeah.
It's like mobility on the moon. This noble whatever thing that transcends time and space in some kind of higher, that you dance with the angels or something like that. No, you're doing a very practical job. You're doing something rare, and in the best setting and the best world, what you do would also still just be a practical part of life, and it's something to be proud of. Certainly something to be proud of.
Yeah.
Take pride in your work, but it's not. So
one of the you put it in a way that reminds me of one of my professors, Reinaldo Baca, when I was in the graduate program, and he says, and of course, I'd already been a school teacher by the time I was, in graduate school, and it was very obvious to me. It's just that I remember in a conversation with him, we were both lamenting the fact that educators, and particularly university educators, and perhaps especially university educators, university factory workers that happen to, deposit information onto paper and into the heads of students and computer screens these days, right? They think, many do believe that they are up on the ivory tower. Many believe that they are not workers. They refuse, many university educators refuse to work collectively, and many refuse and are opposed to the creation of university syndicates, university educator syndicate, university teachers, professors, unions. It's a shame, it's a shame. We're out of time.
I mean, I think that people, like I don't want to make people feel as though that they shouldn't like reach for the stars and try and like be ambitious and want to write these things and have their name be spoken for centuries and that sort of thing. And so I understand that the want of to write work that is immortal. I mean, I understand that impulse.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're a worker. I mean, it does not mean in your day-to-day you're not a worker. It does not mean you're absent that. I remember being on a campus where these students were talking about bringing together, because there was these horrible abuses that were going on with the worker abuses that were going on against the food preparation, against the food prep workers. And they were saying like, well, we're going to get custodial. We're going to get we're going to get the workers plus the teaching staff plus the students. And I had to be like, well, why do you think of the teaching staff as not the students? I mean, as not the workers. You know what I'm saying? Why do you think of organizing teachers as different? You're not saying like you think of the custodial, and you think of the food prep workers as like one and the same, but then the teachers are something different. But in reality, I mean, many of your professors that you're going to get involved are adjunct professors, right? Majority of them are adjunct professors. And a custodian, if they got a good union contract, is making maybe $70,000 a year, right? Which is much more than an adjunct professor. So I mean, they're actually in a different they're actually in a different income bracket, to be honest. But even making kind of poverty wages, if you still hold that title as an instructor, professor, doctor, you think of yourself as just different, and that is actually not just to the detriment of the collective organizing. It's actually to the detriment of you as an individual, because you're not going to be as willing to engage in collective organizing to better align. It better get your condition to improve. You'll be like me at 5 years old, throwing himself on the floor. Civil rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, Matt, we're up for some poetry.
All right.
Poetry that will synthesize our discussion. We didn't get to a discussion of the formal subjection of labor and the real subjection of labor, which is something that I'm really interested to talk about, but we'll do so next week. Matt, why don't you synthesize today's discussion poetically?
Well, since we talked so much about teaching, I'll do this one. It's called Pedagogy of the Oppressor. And when they read in conquest, and when they thought of process, and when they wrote again and again, it was the word progress. And when they spoke, a festival of bayonets impaled the audience. Line the children. It's getting late November. Teach them Pilgrim. Teach them Indian. Speak of gratitude. Speak of friendship.
Words to contemplate for your work week. All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. See you soon.
See you soon.